Hello everybody, welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today we are going to discuss about Dalit women's voices in history. This is a paper written by Tarushika Sarvesh and Rama Shankar Singh. This is part of Women and History module coordinated by Professor Rekha Pandey. I am Dr. Rashmi Bachu, associated with University of Hyderabad. Dalits, as we all know, have been one of the most marginalized sections of the Indian society. Caste in India has been a living reality, and throughout historical times, we have seen caste evolve. It was not always in the present form as we find it today. Nonetheless, it has a very long history. In fact, as long as the Indian history is. And since the ancient times, Indian society has divided people into various sections, especially the four Varnas, and the lowest of these were considered as Shudras. In the course of time, as I said, the deprived and the marginalized sections came to assert themselves throughout history. We see in some or other form they tried to put forward their voices, to their claims to equality and equal rights and equal resources. But it is only in the recent times, the modern times, we find concerted efforts and organized efforts being done by these sections, and they have come forward through the name Dalit. This is the word which was not used earlier. Nonetheless, it has now become a very important term, not just as a social identity but also as a political instrument. And through the use of this term, we see greater assertion being made by the marginalized sections, and they have been able to, in some measure, regain their rights and their voices, especially if not the rights. We can say that the levels of social justice in any society can be figured only by taking into consideration the most marginalized of the societies. So in that sense, the history of Dalits becomes very important. Tracing the Dalit women's history in the history of Indian society, it helps not only to gain, to allow them to gain visibility, but also allows the society as a whole to look inwards into itself. This is very significant. It helps in tracking the patterns and the processes of social change within the society from below. And this is significant. Again, a development history from below or change from below is something we have been noticing in the recent scholarships. Here, in order to there is a twofold kind of study that one needs to do. Of course, the idea of Dalit or the identity of the Dalits is important as the downtrodden and the marginalized sections of the society. But in addition to that, the history of women is again replete with a very similar kind of pattern, where women have been a victim of patriarchy, of male domination, and of being the insignificant other in the society. So in that sense, there is a dual exercise that we are doing today, looking at the history of the Dalits as well as the history of the women. So in other words, the Dalit women have to deal with double kind of marginalization, that of caste as well as gender. So the term Dalit is explained by many thinkers as well as writers. This one seems to be particularly important. This is by Dr. Gangadhar Pantwane of Aurangabad, a scholar of Aurangabad. He says that Dalit is not a caste. He is a man exploited by social and economic tradition of the country. He does not believe in God, rebirth, soul, or any holy books teaching separation, fate, and heaven because they have made him a slave. He does not believe in humanism. Dalit is a symbol of change and revolution. Unquote. It is believed that Baba Saheb Ambedkar, during his years as a student in the Columbia University from 1913 to 1916, became aware of the consciousness and the assertion of the blacks in America. It was this movement of African Americans which gave the base for developing a strategy of struggle against caste discrimination in Indian society to Baba Saheb Ambedkar. Similarly, Suyamariyathai Iyakkam of the self-respect movement launched by Periyar E.V. Ramasamy Naicker has majorly contributed towards Dalit struggles, and it also made Dalit women voices and concerns come to the forefront. It has been a long criticism by various scholars against these movements, that these movements, although they are very aggressive and they assert themselves, but by and large they have been limited to the male Dalits and their concerns, and the voices of the women have been left out of these historical movements. There is another criticism leveled against the feminist movement itself, which originated in India in the last millennium and in the last century, and it has been considered as, though progressive, by and large it remained the prerogative of the caste woman, and the Dalit woman could never make a breakthrough into the feminist movement of India. We shall be discussing about some of the major developments which led to the rising of the Dalit women's voices and their issues in the history of India. Here it is important to understand that when I say voice is considered to be a very important aspect of human life. In order to get rights, in order to get treatment which is equal to others in the society or in the family or within a community, it is important that the voices of each and every individual is heard, and it is important that such an individual who feels oppressed or who feels unequal or ill-treated need to raise their voice and say what they feel. So voice in that sense becomes an expression of what that individual thinks or believes. So in that sense, voice is used in this talk. With regard to the history of India, we have, as I said earlier, the history of India has been a complicated affair, and throughout historical times, different movements had emerged which led to the assertion of the marginalized sections, the caste marginalized sections. And at different points of time, they tried to assert themselves and they tried to put forward their right to equal treatment within the society. So the beginning, of course, it starts with the Vedic times, and during the Vedic times, the society was divided into 4 categories: Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and the Sudra. The Sudras, of course, during this time were accorded the lowest of the status, and as we go beyond the Vedic period, the Sudras were accorded even more and more of lesser status, and there was lots of prohibitions against them. They were not allowed to partaking in the Vedic education was beyond comprehension, but even listening to the Vedas was prohibited to them, and there were all kinds of atrocities were perpetrated against them in case they happened to listen to the Vedic hymns. hot oil was poured into their ears, so on and so forth. So these are all known facts to us. Similar to the Shudra male, the Shudra women were also discarded, and as I said, because of their being women, they had to bear double brunt of the society, and in the rituals of everyday life, in the activities of the everyday life, they were discarded as impure and not fit for equal treatment by the rest of the three sections. So the idea of purity and punishment for touching Dalits was prevalent in the society, especially with regard to the women. A Dvija, or a twice born caste male, was never supposed to be with, or he should not be seen with the Shudra woman, and if he did so, he was suspended from all kinds of Vedic activities, so on and so forth. So there were all kinds of prohibitions recorded in these ritualistic texts. Around the 6th century, we see a major transition happening, or change rather, whereas several heterodox sects came up which were against the Vedic traditions, which were against the ideas, the practices of sacrifices and idol worship, so on and so forth. So it is these sects which gave some relief, spiritual as well as social relief, to the downtrodden castes, and that included the women of the Shudra caste as well. Buddha, of Buddhism, and Mahavira of Jainism were important, but perhaps the most important example is Makhali Gosala of the Ajivika sect. And it is said that he particularly admired the Shudra women for what they were going through in the society and the strong will that they had despite all these activities that were happening against them. There is one particular lady referred to as Hala, who was a Shudra woman who extended patronage to Gosala when he was wandering, and she looked after him. And that is why he admired the Shudra woman so much. And the name of Hala as a patron of Gosala is important for the history of Dalit women, because it denotes the idea of how Dalit women could rise to a position of prominence through their everyday activity, and it also denotes the right of salvation of Dalit woman by her own choice, where she refused the Vedic traditions and adopted the philosophy propagated by Makkala Gosala. This choice becomes even more visible in the poems of the text Terigata. The world of the ordained woman in the Terigata is one of sexual equality, which was in stark contrast to the social equalities between men and women in lay life as it existed in those times. A close reading of this text, which is considered as the first feminist text of India, and gives a glimpse of inner aspirations of women from the lower strata of this time. Next important change came through what is known as the Bhakti movement during the medieval period in India. The Bhakti movement happened across the various regions of the Indian subcontinent, but by and large it was dominated by the male saints. This is not to say that there were no women saints. There were many women saints who took part in the Bhakti movement, and they propagated the ideas of equality and liberation for women, and this included the Dalit women also. In an insightful study of the Bhakti movement from 6th to 17th century Common Era, we find Professor Vijay Ramaswamy has underlined the social background of women saints in South India. There were many women from the Shudra Varna, from the Mahars or the untouchable castes, the carpenters, the spinners, the Chandalas, the Velalas, the hawkers, Paraya and Malla communities. Professor Ramaswamy highlights that out of 75 women saints, 41% of women saints belong to the untouchable and the artisanal class. So this is very significant because again, as I said, this fact gave voice to the aspirations of the downtrodden women in those times. When we come to the modern period, this is significant. The project of modernity was seen as a project of liberation for every individual. That included the women also. So modern educator created a class of people who were very sympathetic towards the cause of women. The first half of the 19th century, when colonial government was in effect, abolished some very heinous practices against women. For instance, sati, child marriage, polygamy, and certain laws on widow remarriage also. However, significant as they are, the beneficiaries of these rules were women from the upper castes only. Although the laws were in place, it was not possible for the women from the lower sections to gain advantage of the existing laws. So at the other end of the battle of emancipation, there were Dalit women who were fighting the unequal battles of British rule in India. So in a conventional and subtle way, the historiography, within the historiography, the Dalits were absent during this period as well. Their presence is not felt in the regular historiography of modern India as such. The beginning of nationalism in India is believed to be the event of 1857, the revolt of 1857, when the first upsurge against the British rule began. And this, as I said, it played a great role in the making of modern consciousness in India. Throughout the next century, we see lots of a legacy of revolt against colonial government being created. There were different sections which took part in these revolts, and almost all of them have made themselves visible and they have claimed their place within this legacy. It seems that the Dalits were the last entrants in this claim to legacy of nationalism. In recent times, we see these groups highlighting the role of women heroes. In search of icons and symbols for the Dalit women, we see the importance of these women heroes coming to the fore. One particular such figure is Jhalkari Bai, and the other one is Uda Devi, who were no less, who competed with the upper caste heroes, women heroes of those times. Jhalkari Bai was a woman of Kori caste, whereas Uda Devi was from Pasi. Both Kori and Pasi castes were untouchable castes in the Hindu social order, and they were categorized as scheduled castes in modern independent India. And Jhalkari Bai is associated with Rani Lakshmi Bai of Jhansi. She fought along with Rani of Jhansi, but as we see, she doesn't get her due share in the regular history writings. Dalits today consider Jhalkari Bai as a prominent freedom fighter of 1857. So in this process, these women heroes have infused emancipations in the Dalit voices. These are the figures of Jhalkari Bai. This is a statue which is found in Jhansi today, and this is the statue of Uda Devi at Sikandar Bagh in Lucknow. After the revolt of 1857, a new education system, the press, printing press, the social movements, all these events accelerated the process of women visibility in public domains, especially the Gandhian movement. Though it had its limitations, some women carved a niche for themselves and lighted the path towards emancipation and liberation. The early women voices like Pandita Ramabai and Tarabai Shinde tried to bring to the fore the condition of women in general in society. However, they did not focus their focus was more on women's conditions in general, and the caste realities of the prevalent times was lost to them. The clubbing of women's voices indiscriminately with no caste distinction as it existed in those times kind of buried the voices of Dalit women within the mounds of hierarchical and patriarchal intersection of the Indian society. The women in those times had to deal, even today, they have to deal with threefold discrimination, that of caste, class, and patriarchy. So, various Dalit women today have tried to rethink and reread these historical movements, especially the movements like the Telangana movement, the Ambedkarite movement, and the self-respect movement, to bring out the voices of the Dalit women and what contribution they made to the realm of social justice. These voices are brought out with the help of Dalit women's testimonials and as a part of literature, giving first-person accounts of discrimination and exploitation. These are also brought out by looking into the participation of various women rights movements that have happened in the recent times. The case histories of a few women activists who participated in the movement and national struggles brings out how such movements provided the space to the Dalit women to transform their lives and have a voice of their own. One such Dalit woman was Moovalur Ramamirtham Ammayar, who belonged to the Dalit caste, from which a particular caste from which the Devdasis were drawn. She narrated her story in Kudi Arasu magazine in 1925. She belonged to the Devdasi caste, but it seems that her family in particular never had a tradition of Devdasi system. So she was forced into this custom to fetch money for her family by participating in this profession. Later, we see, after reading various religious texts and giving it a deep thought, she realized the exploitation of lower caste women which was happening through Devdasi system, and she walked out of this profession and married a musician called Suyambu Pillai. Ramamirthan Ammayar began her political career in the Indian National Congress but left it to join the self-respect movement in the mid-1920s. She has published a particular voluminous novel in Tamil in 1936 on Devdasis and wrote fictitious series Damayanti in Dravida Nadu in 1945. Other Dalit women voices that in history that have made themselves heard are that of the personalities like Savitribai Phule, perhaps the most important amongst all. Savitribai was the first low-caste woman to have stressed the importance of education and English through her poems. She, along with her husband Jyotiba Phule, raised the issue of Dalit women in particular and women in general. She wrote poems which got recognized in the British Empire. Savitribai's collections of poems came out in 1854. It was entitled as Kavya Phule. Similarly, E.V.R. Nagamayar, the wife of E.V. Ramaswamy, was a member of the All India Congress Committee. When Ramaswamy got arrested under Section 144 of the Criminal Procedure Code for violating prohibitory orders, Nagamayar not only organized a group of women and carried out picketing, she also raised public consciousness by carrying on a propaganda through the streets of Travancore to fight for the rights of non-Brahmins to walk the streets where the Brahmins lived. This had reflections of the black feminism of the USA. Similarly, women's participation in the Ambedkarite movement was brought out by Marathi Dalit writer Urmila Pawarand Meenakshi. She wrote Amhihi Itihas Ghadwala, Ambedkari Chalwalitil Striyancha Sahabhag. Urmila Pawar not only contributed towards making the Dalit woman visible in Ambedkarite movement, but also through her research and testimonials brought out the grim reality of the missing voices in the archival material. She also highlighted the conspicuous absence of Dalit women's voices and the missing acknowledgement of Dalit women's participation in the available literature. It is till the activities of these various women happened, and they brought out the voices of the Dalit women into the mainstream. The Dalit woman was given an overall male identity, and only male Dalit voices were listened to and celebrated by the Dalit leaders in history as well as in the Dalit literature. In addition to the above referred to literature, we can also look at the autobiographical works, writings of some of these Dalit female writers, especially Bhama's Karukku in 1992, which goes beyond the genre of a typical autobiographical novel. According to MSS Pandian, who argues that Bhama verbalizes her own life story, it depletes the autobiographical I, which he calls an outcome of bourgeoisie individualism, and displaces it with the collectivity of the Dalit community. This way, her story becomes a story of the community, where traumatic experience of an individual converts itself into a collective biography. The autobiography of Kaushalya Baisantri tells the inner world of a Dalit woman who is twice excluded and jeopardized by male dominance and imposed demerit of being a Dalit woman. Her autobiography, Dohra Abhishap or Doubly Cursed, was the first autobiography of a woman in Hindi language. She was a Marathi Dalit activist and had a legacy of Marathi Dalit movement behind her. Her biography puts things in greater worldview. It analyzes not only the caste oppression but also the oppression by husband. Her caste becomes secondary, and patriarchy here dominates the everyday life of a Dalit woman. So far, we have seen how the Dalit identity of these women were important, and it comes to the forefront through various kinds of literature that they themselves have produced. However, we can also here see how strongly patriarchy plays itself within the Dalit movement as well. In a critical study of literary texts written by some Dalit activists and writers, the Dalit male writers have selectively, it is argued, it is a case against them that these male Dalit writers have selectively excluded the female voice and have brought forth their own viewpoint with regard to the position of the Dalit women and the kind of exploitation they have undergone. So it is the male voice which becomes prominent, and the voice of the female members of the community is by and large ignored in this literature. The Dalit male writers have ignored the pain which is visible in these Dalit women's narratives, and portrayed their own understanding, their own interpretation of what this pain and suffering has been. Mentioning the traditional problem of rape of Dalit women as part of atrocities in general on the Dalit community by the upper caste people seems to be the mainstay of the male Dalit members. At the same time, the same kind of atrocities perpetrated by the Dalit male members of the community on the women of the same community is somehow not addressed in this literature. Most of the short stories by male Dalit writers portray the male Dalit protagonist as the sufferer throughout the narrative, who finally seeks emotional and political reawakening as a Dalit, whereas the women are never portrayed, or by and large, they are not portrayed as an important factor in the politics of the narrative. The 1990s was an important decade so far as the history of Dalit, modern Dalit history goes. Um, During this time, we see many Dalit women's organizations coming into being. One of the most important one was National Federation of Dalit Women, NFDW, set up in 1995 by a Dalit activist called Ruth Manoharama. NFDW brought to limelight the state's inability to protect the human rights of Dalit women. At the UN World Conference Against Racism held in Durban, South Africa in 2001, NFDW even demanded that caste discrimination be declared a form of racism. There were also a few other organizations, All India Dalit Women's Forum, which came up in 1996, an organization of Dalit Christian women came up in 1997. The focus of these organizations was Dalit women, their life, their experiences, and their struggle against exploitation. We come to the last section of this talk. It deals with the Indian Constitution and how the Indian Constitution envisioned the Dalit emancipation or justice for Dalits, and that includes the women as well. The legacy of Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar and the pursuit of social justice has created what is known as the Dalit public. In fact, the contributions of Ambedkar has been immense to the consciousness of the Dalits, and most of the progress that has happened in the recent times post the independence of India has been because of the efforts undertaken by Ambedkar himself. Today we see the Dalits have become a major voice socially as well as politically in the Indian society, and this is manifested in the role that the Dalit community has been playing, both as voters as well as contestants in the elections. They have been able to put forward their voices, their representations in the parliaments as well as the state assemblies, and today they are a major push in the political activities that happen around. Perhaps the most important personality in terms of visibility as a Dalit woman, as a representative of the Dalits, has been Mayawati, the four-time Chief Minister of the largest state of India, Uttar Pradesh. This is a testimony to the fact that Mayawati's rise to power, her assertions and social engineering to gain political representation is immensely acknowledged, and it is commendable as such. Though the Mayawati has been one of the important personalities in the recent times so far as Dalit women's identity goes, there has been a lot of iconography and a kind of superficial representation that has manifested during her reign, during her rule. It cannot be said that she has made a great contribution towards the cause of Dalit women. Nonetheless, in general, her contribution has been immense as such. There are other Dalit women leaders also from various other political parties like Krishna Tirath, Shailaja, Meera Kumar, etc., who have represented Dalit women in their respective parties as well as in the assemblies and the parliament, and they have been the representatives of Dalit women's voices. In the rural areas, we see in the Panchayat Raj institutions, various women Dalit women have come forward to occupy the posts of the Sarpanch, for instance, and the village heads and members of the Panchayat institutions, and they have served towards the cause of the Dalit women and towards emancipation of Dalits in general. Again, in these institutions, we see certain portions of the seats are reserved for the women, and most of the time, these seats are now allotted to the Dalit women themselves. These women seats. So. So through these various kinds of representations, political representations, the Dalit women have been able to put forward their voice in the everyday life of a democracy, and it is because of democracy this particular development has been made possible. And this is not to say that there is an end to the opposition and the exploitation of Dalits. In fact, these assertions, political as well as social assertions by the Dalit community and especially the Dalit women have been meted out with greater aggression, and there is a lot of opposition to their participation in the public life. So they still bear the brunt of being of belonging to the marginalized section, of being Dalit and of being women. So the problems in a certain way for the Dalit women have compounded in today's lives, but at the same time they have been able to regain their voices and assert themselves within the society and in public. Towards the end, one can say that throughout the historical process, we have seen so many changes taking place in the form of the rights being accorded to the Dalits through the heterodox sects, the activities of the heterodox sects of the 6th century onwards in the ancient period, or the continuous movement of Bhakti saints during the medieval period, or the constituting of the Constitution of India in independent India, and the democracy and the benefits that it has brought to the Dalit women. On the one hand, we have these developments. On the other hand, we have the community, the members of the community themselves struggling a lot to come forward and to put forward their voices, their ideas, their assertions and their aspirations into the mainstream, and regaining their positions as equal citizens and equal members of the society. This we have seen they have done through various kinds of activities, both in terms of producing the literature, where they have asserted their identity. At the same time, they are also asserting their Dalit identity. They are not choosing to be something else. They are choosing to be themselves and claiming to be equal, and in some case gaining that. On the other hand, again, the constitution which affords them to compete with the rest of the society as equal citizens, and use the constitution and the rights invested therein as political tools to further their own aspirations and their own identities within the society. So these developments in a nutshell have been very much advantageous to the Dalit community as a whole, and to Dalit women in particular. But as I said, so far as the criticism goes, and there is, we do not see an end to the exploitation and the problems faced by the Dalit women. In fact, it continues as it was before in a certain way. It is imperative that the Dalit women continue to make their presence felt through giving voice to the various experiences that they have in various ways and through various kinds of representations that they have been doing. With this, I end the discussion, and I hope this talk has been useful to all the students who have been listening. Thank you very much.